Good afternoon. We'll introduce ourselves, and then we'll ask you to introduce yourselves, and then we'll move on. My name is Margaret Kirkpatrick, and I'm your presiding judge this afternoon.
And David Reese.
Be seated. Or stand.
My name is Hannah Horton. I'm Shirley Wu.
I'm Jeff Smith.
I'm Kaylee Chen.
I am Jeremy Dellinger. Our coaches are Paul Gamson, Ashley Vaughn, and Jeremy Thront, and our teacher is Miss Portia Hull, and we are Unit 6.
Very good, Unit 6. We are asking you question 1 this afternoon. Judicial review relies on a fire alarm model using the complaints of damaged parties to trigger scrutiny of government policy. How would you describe the fire alarm model, and what are its advantages and disadvantages? Why and how did African Americans and other groups use the fire alarm model to call attention to their grievances? And in addition to court challenges, in what other ways have damaged parties tried to change government policies, and with what success?
Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution grants to the courts judicial power, yet does not define it. However, Federalist Papers 78 argued that the judiciary branch should have the power to rule laws unconstitutional, which became a reality in the court case Marbury v. Madison in 1803. In Marbury, Chief Justice Marshall ruled that the courts do have the power to declare laws unconstitutional when he found that issuing a writ of mandamus was unconstitutional. The judicial review process became a major piece of the checks and balances system, balancing the power of the two branches. Our judicial review process has been described as a fire alarm model, in which damaged parties pull the alarm or file a case to bring redress to their grievances. Justice Holmes analogized the court's role to an oyster, which wait for food to come to their mouths, but have no power to go out to seek that food.
One advantage of the fire alarm model of judicial review is that it gives everyone, even minorities, an accessible forum to grieve their grievances. Another advantage is that requiring parties to be damaged saves time and money because the court does not deal with hypothetical situations that may never occur. Additionally, having federal judges be appointed for life reduce the risk that they will be influenced by political pressure. Finally, judicial review made by the Supreme Court are blanket decisions that apply across this country. For example, Roe v. Wade in 1970 made abortion legal in all the states. One disadvantage of the fire alarm model is that it cannot review the constitutionality of the issue unless the issue is brought before them by a damaged party. Also, court can take so long that cases become moot. For example, KB David Douglas School District in 1988 was declared moot because by the time they got to the court, graduation was already over and there was nothing for continuing.
In our democracy, the legislative and executive branches are elected by the majority, which sometimes disregards the rights of minorities. Judges are not subject to the same political pressures as the other branches, so minority groups use the fire alarm model in order to protect their rights. This is one of the checks and balances that ensures fairness in our system. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 is a good example. It overturned the prior decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, which rejected the idea of separate but equal schools for blacks and whites because it violated the 14th Amendment. Another example is Griswold v. Connecticut, in which the court struck down a state law that made it illegal to distribute contraceptives to married couples. Another landmark case was Pleiter v. Doe, which overturned a Texas law that banned undocumented immigrant children from public schooling. The Supreme Court ruled that the law was unreasonable and violated the 14th Amendment.
Courts cannot remedy all complaints. Aside from challenging the government through court, there are other ways activists can challenge the government. People can run for office or support candidates who agree with them. Many protest their rights, such as women who, through protests and assemblies, forced an amendment granting them the right to vote. Another way is to use the media. A great example is the Arab Spring protests, which reformed and overthrew many governments in the Middle East using social media.
Another example is civil disobedience, which, modeled after Henry David Thoreau, has proven to be very successful. Muhammad Ali used it by refusing the draft, and Martin Luther King Jr. advocated it when he led the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. During the civil rights era, it was used with Rosa Parks, sit-ins, and even during the 1968 Olympics. In these Olympics, many African American athletes boycotted the games, refusing to represent a country that treated them as less than human. Others protested by wearing gloves
and other symbols. While all these examples had varying degrees of success at the time, as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The moral arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Change is not always fast or easy, but over time, we move towards a more perfect union." Thank you. We are now ready for your questions.
Thank you. Can you distinguish for us de facto segregation from de jure segregation and talk about which you think is more difficult to change and why?
Can you elaborate on de facto and de jure segregation?
Desegregation by law versus desegregation in fact.
Well, there has been a couple desegregated by law, as well as segregation by law, which is Jim Crow laws, which actually happened in the South, which made it harder for African American groups to really do anything, as well as the poll taxes and the literacy tests that were put upon African Americans to do the right to have the right to vote.
Looking at segregation of fact is that the courts have not always been able to keep or do not have the power to segregate different minorities, but do have the power to kind of set in through case law a number of what they believe should be under law segregation.
Thank you.
How would you explain civil disobedience and how it's distinct from just breaking the law?
Civil disobedience is often described as knowingly breaking the law and then willing to be able to accept the consequences of breaking the law. A great example of this really is the protests that happened during the Civil Rights Movement, in which many African Americans protested the Jim Crow laws by breaking them and sitting at lunch counters, and they accepted the punishment of having to go to jail, just as Gandhi did when he led the movement in India.
Gandhi actually set out lots of a very strict path to follow of civil disobedience, and following these civil disobedience cases were Martin Luther King, which he used the civil disobedience order, if you will, to get through civil rights. As well as we can apply this to marijuana laws now. The reason why we haven't seen like marijuana sit-ins and like smokeouts or whatever is because people aren't ready to face being arrested to protest their rights.
In addition, we can see civil disobedience acts through organizations like the Black Panthers during the Mexican Olympics, when one of the gold medalists on national TV wore a black glove and raised his hand up representing Black Power, which we can see was not necessarily the best thing for them. But it definitely was an act of civil disobedience and got the attention of millions within the United States.
So sticking with the discussion of civil disobedience, I think there may be some differences of opinion about whether Edward Snowden's leaks were acts of civil disobedience. So I'd like to hear your views on that and on the merits of what he did.
Personally, I believe that the Snowden leaks were not an act of civil disobedience because he broke the law but then fled the country and was not willing to accept the punishment, as is traditional of people who use civil disobedience.
And this links in with the civil rights too, is that many went to jail to get through the point that they are ready to do anything they can do to make people see, and Snowden wasn't ready to do that, and therefore it wasn't very much civil disobedience, more as it was trying to show the U.S. that the things that go on in the government.
Actually, during that case, the government has power to overhear conversations because they're under the preamble. They are required to protect the country.
I'm going to take us back to the 60s. Can you talk a bit about the Voting Rights Act and how it has addressed the grievances of minorities?
by giving minorities the equal right to vote, it lets them represent what they believe and truly will allow for an increase in their individual rights and freedoms. And by through the and as of recent, Shelby v. Holder, that court case addresses the overturning of the Voting Rights Act, and it's now showing that Texas, through passing voting cards, might actually restrict those freedoms again.
This also shows the kind of abuse that the states can do upon the people, and the duty of the federal government to use federalism to ensure the rights of citizens, such as the Voting Rights Act, which was suppressing the people in the southern states at the time.
What role have voluntary organizations played in triggering the scrutiny of government policies, and why is that role important?
Did you say voluntary organizations?
One of the voluntary organizations, may I finish my thought? Yeah, thank you. Voluntary organizations have taken the willpower of the people to just put under scrutiny the federal government.